Hello, I'm Dennis Leach. The Workers' World series focuses on the world of work and issues relevant to all workers, from the struggle for a living wage to safe public transport to solidarity with workers of the world. An in-depth analysis and debate by studio panelists on the national minimum wage in South Africa. Coming to you from our transmission center at CTV Studios in Salt River. Workers' World starts right now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system a regress, but the Soviet system now progress. So which
Good
one of
evening
them?
and welcome to the second episode of the National Minimum Wage. Last week we discussed in our show that the discussions about the National Minimum Wage commenced in February 2014 and were kickstarted by our very own president. However, due to delays, the deputy president took the discussions further, and what has come out now is that in August 2017 will mark the end of the discussions, and the national minimum wage will be implemented in 2018. With us on the panel, there's Trenton Elsie, the director of the Labour Research Service.
Good evening.
Welcome again.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you. We have Dion Simons, the SACTU provincial organizer. Welcome.
Thank you, Yanda.
And of course, we have now on our screen Johan van Niekerk, lead negotiator for FEDUSA. Welcome.
Good evening, Yanda.
Well, you recall in our previous episode the issues that we discussed. However, we've had quite a number of questions that I would really want us to commence with. One of them asking about the difference between the national minimum wage and the living wage. What is the difference between the two, and why are we not fighting for the living wage?
If you look at a living wage, we formulate, or we see it as a wage that will cater for a family of 5. In other words, it is a much higher rate than the national minimum wage. We see the national minimum wage as a stepping stone to eventually arrive at a living wage. So it's a process, and we start at a certain level which we believe is reasonable, and eventually we will reach the stage of the living wage, which currently stands at plus minus 5,500 rand.
Well, that's interesting. We talk about 5,500 as a living wage, and yet we've seen miners. You know, when they were fighting for their rights, they wanted a 12,500 rand.
Yeah.
Why are we starting at 5,000, and what would be the difference between the two?
And I would disagree. I think often these debates we drag down by minimalist measurements. How much money do you need to buy enough food to eat decently? I mean, that's an incredibly low benchmark, you know, just getting enough food into the system so that you can go to work day in, day out. I've been involved in some work that's exploring the idea of a decent life. So I think more in line with the original ideals of a living wage. It wasn't about surviving. Living wage was supposed to be something a lot more than surviving. It was about living, I think, a decent life. And it's quite shocking. Some of the initial findings suggest, you know, that this national minimum wage would be as much as like 5 times less than what would constitute a decent life. I'd call it like a decent life deficit. You know, we're at a very, very low level. And this is perhaps a very small step in the right direction. But we're a long way from a decent life for all.
I think also, Yanda, that inequality that is there between the lower income earner and the individual that is earning the high wage, that will never close, that gap will be there between, that inequality will be there. And that is, you know, the national minimum wage is a step in the right direction, setting, you know, that benchmark as a start. I also would want to add on a living wage, you know, I think that from labor side, you know, the intention of, you know, having a living wage is not only to survive, is to have that opportunity as a worker in the country, to at least to have that, you know, assurance that your family will be covered for where food, you know, and these things is concerned.
If I may respond
Yes.
to the question about the mineral sector or the mining sector, if you look at that sector, you compare it to all the other sectors in South Africa, you will see they are the best paid sector. I think currently the minimum...
The mining sector
The mining
is the
sector,
best
yeah.
paid?
Well, I would believe it's the best paid sector in South Africa at this stage. If you look at, for example, the minimum that a person is earning in the mining, I would think it's about between 7,000 and 8,000 rand already. So if we consider what Dion was saying now, we start and we think of people not earning even 2,000 rand, and we need to bring up their salary to a reasonable salary. Then I think a step from 2,000 to 3,500 is an enormous increase for that employers. We must keep in mind that one of the concerns of a national minimum wage is to protect people of losing jobs. So it's a concern from our side. Although in designing the legislation, we will build in unfair labour practice, automatic unfair labour practices if a person is dismissed, to cater to keep the labour cost at the same level and so on. So there's a number of things that we need to keep in mind when we talk about different sectors.
You know, there's something that's very fascinating to me is that every time we talk about benefits that go to the worker, we tend to worry about job loss. You know, but when we talk about profits to the employer, you know, we should all be comfortable in that. How fair is that? I mean, is that even correct to speak in that sense?
It's not fair at all. There's a very strong bias in how we talk about the economy, how we allocate value. We think nothing of a CEO who, you know, certainly is an important person, no question. But when you consider that someone, a real person, might need to work something like 350 years to earn what they earn in a single year, that's got to suggest that something's not quite right. You know, how can one person need several lifetimes to earn what somebody else earns in a year? I think there's a problem of allocating value to jobs, to people. And no, it's far from fair.
And adding to that, if you look at the Employment Equity Act, it made provision for inequality in remuneration. And yes, the only thing that we saw up to date from a labour point of view is a report coming to the Department of Labour as part of the Employment Equity report.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes,
a difficult
please.
question.
Yes, please do.
Why have we seen so little coming out of the Employment Equity Act? It's actually a piece of law that could be used to manage the distance between the lowest paid and the highest paid, and we've seen nothing, and it's actually quite strange. I don't understand.
I think that is precisely our concern. The current inspectorate, the 1,000 of them, the 1,000 plus, they cannot meet with all of these employees where there's concerns or deviations from the plan. So they cannot address these concerns.
But Johan, here's my question, and perhaps
employers have been reporting, Ayanda.
Yeah, and perhaps to
the
the panel as well. We keep talking about the inequalities, right? And it seems to me that whatever effort we are doing, we seem to be perpetuating somehow these inequalities, because no one bothers to say, let's address the inequalities from the past. You know, at some point we need to be fair and say, oh, well, these people have been underpaid for a very long time, for many, many years. And judging from where they should be, this is where they should be today. You know, let's start there and then let's see how then we move forward. And why are we not doing that? Why are we taking the minimalist approach that Trenton has been referring to? What makes that feasible?
Yanda, what is fairly good news is that what the legislation suggested is that this, specifically inequality, will be given to the National Minimum Wage Committee. And they will have to monitor it, and they will have to put plans in place to address these inequalities.
And
So
who
it will
will
be
be
one
that
of the
committee?
that committee will be consisting of representatives of labour, representatives of business, and then of course representatives of government, as well as 2 or 3 professional people that will assist with the research. But eventually they will have the powers to make recommendations to the Minister of Labour, to address these inequalities that currently exist and how to go back to the past.
I want to come back to discuss that point after the commercial break.
Workers' World continues with the national minimum wage. We'll be right back. Our topic is the national minimum wage in South Africa. Back to our panel, Ayanda Nabe.
Well, we were talking about, I mean, you were on the floor. Let me leave it to you. You want to finish what you were saying?
We were talking about inequality, and we are correct in saying that this issue did not receive the attention it deserves. There's many reasons for this if we listen to the explanation of the Department of Labour, but we believe with this function now being allocated to this new committee, looking at wages in totality, it will receive the attention it requires.
And what powers do you have as members of this committee versus the powers of the minister? I mean, we've seen cases where a report was tabled and campaigns were endorsed and embarked on, but the minister then rewrites everything that the committee says.
Yeah, no, you're quite right, and I think this is one of the concerns of Labour, and this is why we were saying we are totally opposed against the power of the minister to override any recommendations made by the committee. We believe that that recommendation that's been made must go through. She must sort of just ratify it. She will not have we believe she should not have the power to outvote it or to change it, because we are concerned that the work of this committee could be jeopardized as a result of that.
Mm-hmm.
That ultimately will be a massive problem if we're leaving the final decision making for one person to
But what can you do?
decide.
Because we've seen it happen and nothing has happened to the ministers, and the minister's decision still stands.
Yeah.
What powers does this committee have? Is this a way of just bluffing the poor workers, giving them false hope? Or is this a genuine effort to improve the lives of people that you're talking about?
Well, if we look at the composition of this committee, it consists out of really powerful people in terms of knowledge, in terms of the research benefits to their disposal, as well as powers allocated. Yes, it is a concern that it will be a recommendation made to the minister, but it is a draft legislation that is on the table, and it is one of the concerns that we as Labour feel very strong that it should be changed. And we will put in all the efforts to make sure that we change that proposal.
Well, there's something that is very interesting that we captured earlier on, and it relates very well to the sectoral bargaining. You know, when you're talking the minimum wage and what happens with the sectoral bargaining, because you see mining talking about another amount, and we're coming with 3,500 per month, and miners are talking about 12,500. How do we then work around this? How do we make sense of everything that's going on and simplify it for us?
Yeah, Jana, we distinguish between, well, a bargaining council entering into collective agreements between trade unions and the employers' organizations, and then sectoral determinations as determined by the Employment Commission, making recommendations to the minister, which eventually go through. There is a school that believes that sectoral determination should fall away and it should be replaced by the national minimum wage. From Labour's point of view, we do not believe that. We believe the sectoral determination should remain in place as it is, and it will only need to comply with the national minimum wage. All the other benefits mentioned in the sectoral determination should remain in place. Currently, the Department of Labour is visiting all the bargaining councils, and the purpose of this visit is to make sure that the bargaining councils who do not meet the current national minimum wage have a process in place which they will put forward to the Department of Labour how they will achieve that within the shortest space of time.
It's been quite a gentle process design. I mean, it's been a long negotiation. there are already exemptions, phase-in periods, possibility of long sort of phase-in periods. So it's not being rushed on anyone. I think it's very gentle. It could have been a lot harder, I would think.
Yeah, and I mean that's one of the biggest concerns that was raised in the previous show through the WhatsApp messages that we received, is that we're taking too long, and by the time we implement any of these things, it would be too late. The 3,500 will really make no difference because they know time value for money. And it seems as if government is really not jerked up to really attend to the needs of the workers.
Yanda, you raise an interesting point. You're right. With the passing of time, the purchasing power of money is reduced. You need more money next year to buy the same things that you can buy this year. That's inflation. And it is. What's another really important question, Johan, and I'm sure it's being debated, is how it's adjusted just to keep up with inflation. Because it's pointless. In a lot of countries, what you see is a national minimum wage that hasn't been reviewed sometimes in a decade. It's the same amount it always was, but the price of goods has increased so dramatically that it's a joke. So it would be really important, if it was a serious benchmark, that it would be adjusted at the very least by inflation. And what a lot of people don't know is that there's more than one inflation number. Everybody thinks it's one number, but it's actually different for different kinds of households. The way you spend money. People who spend more money effectively experience a different inflation rate sometimes to people who spend a lot less money as a household.
There's something I always want to come back to, is the issue of the living wage. And I really don't want to put this off our discussion tonight. And, COSATU has been having all these campaigns. What happened to them? Are they still an issue for the labor sector?
Yes, and
trade unions,
it is still very key and part of trade unions with inside of COSATU that the living wage campaign is an ongoing campaign. And I just want to go back to the bargaining council, because I think that is very fundamental, that bargaining councils do have already agreements that was reached in 2017. For an example, the 2-year wage agreements that was reached at that specific structures. And I think that from our side is that the national minimum wage is not going to interfere with whatever agreements was already reached come implementation in May next year, where the national minimum wage is concerned. I think that is also very important, that there will be continuation of ongoing discussions surrounding negotiations as the norm. The national minimum wage is only going to be introduced, where workers are not at 3,500 rand, and that is important. We've also will see that some of the sectors, even with the implementation of increases in 2017, that they're not even reaching, the 20 rand per hour mark, and that is ultimately, important also, that that the national minimum wage should and must be implemented comes May 2018.
No, I fully support what Dion is saying. If we go back to the state president's announcement in 2014, you would remember that he was saying that the collective bargaining structures need to be strengthened. And bargaining council is one of the pillars of collective bargaining in our country.
Have they been strengthened?
Well, we did not talk about that part of the project, but the first part is the national minimum wage. But we spend a considerable amount of time also in dealing with strikes, how to make it, how to follow due process, make sure that it is not so violent, make sure that it is not lengthy, and so on. But also on collective bargaining, there's some changes recommended towards Section 32 of the Labour Relations Act, specifically focusing on bargaining councils and the whole process of collective bargaining per se, to improve it and to involve more workers as becoming part of the process. Because we must remember, if my figures is correct, there's only 28% of the workers belonging to trade unions. The rest are not members of trade unions. There's various reasons for that, but if a trade union is involved, collective bargaining immediately become part of the process.
We'll talk more about that when we come from the break.
You are watching Workers' World, coming to you on CTV each week at this time. Watching Cape Town Television with our national minimum wage debate. Back to our panel.
Jan, before we went on the commercial break, we were talking about the bargaining councils and we talk about the violent strikes. But I just want to know, when you're talking about national minimum wage, how do you put that with violent strikes? And in fact, why would you even want to put the two together? One would think that they do not belong together.
Yeah. I think there is a relationship, and we must remember this was part of the State President's State of the Nation address. He was saying he wants us to look at the national minimum wage, but he also wants us to look at industrial action to make sure that it's not a lengthy process that hurt the economy. We will all remember the Marikana strike that lasted for almost 6 months. And
if you relate that to the Marikana strike, one would want to think that the president had in mind a way of pacifying the workers. If you've been suffering for so long,
yeah.
What is lengthy to you if you've really been suffering for more than decades?
Yeah, well, we agree with that. And that was part of our arguments when we were dealing with this specific subject on strikes. Because we believe that's ultimately the weapon of the worker if we fail to reach an agreement on acceptable wages and acceptable benefits. That is the way that we need to go. We need to go on a protected strike, and we need to withdraw our labor to force the employer to agree to what we want as reasonable.
I'd like to hear from you when you talk about this violent strike in the same sentence as the minimum wage.
I think as labor from our side, we don't even do negotiations, in that line for a strike. I think that we've been very, as a trade union perspective, we've been very well behaved when it comes to us doing the negotiations. And I think that also what is important on the national minimum wage is that fear from the employers talking, about strikes, will always be there. And I think that, us as labor, we're not interested in even entertaining, when it comes to strike, because I think that as from COSATU's perspective as a federation, our strikes, we want to be disciplined, and at all times we want to be disciplined, and that's why we not, even want to entertain the linkage of the national minimum wage with violent strikes that we've seen over the last few years.
Trenton.
I'm not sure I see a direct link between notions of tackling violence and strikes and the national minimum wage. It's a false relationship. I would like to suggest that I think we live in a relatively violent society. But at the same time, I would say that this idea of strike violence in South Africa is unfounded. Yeah. I don't see the evidence that we have a particularly violent industrial relations system. It's complete nonsense. It's a fabrication, and nobody should really accept that. Yes, we've had some episodes. We've had strikes over the years where there have been deaths. We've had Marikana more recently, yes, which was a real shock to the national consciousness. But do you want to start talking about where the violence? And funny enough, when you talk about violence, it's as if it's the strikers that are violent, and yet there's constant evidence that it is actually the state repression that seems to be violent against the strikers. And how then the two are put together, it boggles the mind. You must understand that our industrial relations system is also historically highly conflictual. So the parties, employers and unions, come together in a well-rehearsed kind of process that they've been doing for a long time, and it is very conflictual. And it stems from apartheid days, and to some extent has survived into post-apartheid, into a democratic South Africa. It's conflictual, and it's driven by both parties sometimes.
Now, without going into detail about that subject, but I can tell you it was very sensitive, dealing with all of those things, because issues, for example, like the carrying of knobkieries, it was an issue of a long debate. Is it really something that somebody must carry when he's participating in a strike? And there was a long debate of, is it a weapon or is it a symbol, a culture symbol, and so on. So it took a lot of time, but both those subjects, the national minimum wage as well as collective bargaining, together with strikes, were addressed.
I've got to squeeze in this one bit. It's learnership for adults. Why are we not talking about that?
It is true that the learnerships is also put on the table by one of the parties as a possible exclusion. In other words, together with the public works program, they've put the learnerships as a possible exclusion. There is a feeling from Labour side that it should not be exclusion.
Oh, right. It should not be exclusion. That's exciting me. But unfortunately, we've come to the end of our show. So I've got to ask you, gentlemen, the last word from each one of you. Trenton, let's start with you.
It's really important that we don't look at the national minimum wage in isolation and think that it's the only policy measure out there. We must not lose sight of other very important issues. The national minimum wage will do nothing by itself. Well, not nothing, but you know, we're trying to solve complicated problems, and we've got a terrible tension between jobs. We need more jobs. We also need better incomes.
Dion?
I think that Labour is setting that example for the other stakeholders that are part of the discussions to start pulling, you know, and come and conclude this exercise by the end of August.
Johan?
My personal view is that from a Labour perspective, this is a major achievement for us to agree to a national minimum wage with the opportunity to grow it to eventually a living wage.
At home, I'll leave you thinking, is 3,500 per month enough? Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our show, but you can catch us next week, same time, same place. And thank you for watching. Good night.